Thank you, everyone. It's great to be back after that delicious dinner. And I'm glad to see so many people here for this topic, democracy in the Muslim world. I'm just going to tell everyone what the game plan is here. We absolutely have to be finished by 9:30. We may wrap up earlier, but I'm going to go maybe 45, 50 minutes, depending, but go to questions from all of you as well. So we'll try to mix that up. But, you know, when Ken Pollack asked me if I'd do this panel, and then when I looked at everything else you were talking about for 2 days, I called him and I said, Ken, everyone will be talked out, everyone will have talked about democracy in the Muslim world, and what is there new to say? And what we hope that will be new that we say tonight is, you know, we've all been discussing for 2 days this time of wrenching change in the Islamic world, but tonight we have 4 men, and yes, unfortunately they are all men, here, all from countries at different, that's probably something important in that, at different stages in the development of democracy. I mean, we have Egypt, which I hope Ambassador Fahmy will indulge me, is really in the baby step stage. And we have Afghanistan and Iraq, who are a decade or less into it. And then we have Turkey, which has had the design of a parliamentary democracy for a long time, but is certainly redefining it today in a kind of Islamic context. So I think that and of course these countries are all different. If we wanted to have full representation, we should certainly have somebody from one of the very populous Muslim countries, majority countries, Malaysia or Indonesia. But I think we have a representative enough group here to really look at the following question. Does every country in the Muslim world that embarks on the path of democracy or is on the path of democracy have to reinvent the wheel? Or is there something, are there models, are there lessons, are there common solutions to similar challenges that this part of the world can learn from one another, despite differences of, say, history or sect or ethnicity? And then secondly, and I want to be sure to get to this, what can the U.S. and the non-Islamic world in toto do to help that's really going to be helpful and not meddling? So tonight we're going to explore all that with Dr. Abdullah, immediately on my left, former Foreign Minister of Afghanistan and now head of a major opposition group called the Coalition of Change and Hope. Nabil Fahmy, whom I know many of you know, longtime ambassador to Washington, went back a couple of years ago and is now the founding Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at American University of Cairo. Ibrahim Kalin, who is the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor or National Security Advisor to President Erdogan of Turkey, and he's also quite a scholar of Islamic studies. And Jabber al-Jabber, who is from Afghanistan and a member of Parliament. What did I just say? Forgive me. From Iraq and a prominent member of Parliament there. So let me begin, and I think I will begin with Ibrahim Kalin by asking, but all of you to weigh in on this, is there something special or distinctive about democracy in the Muslim world?
Yeah, well, in a sense, yes and no. People in the Arab and Muslim world don't have to reinvent the wheel for a fair, just political system that will recognize and implement the principles of human dignity, justice, equality. These are some universal principles that are shared across the board. But the circumstances in which these principles will be implemented in different countries will obviously display certain variety, certain differences. When Samuel Huntington wrote his famous article, and which he turned into a book later, Clash of Civilizations, some of the observations he made about the Muslim world and the state of democracy in Muslim countries there were very interesting, and in my view, at the time I had written something about it also, were based on some misguided diagnosis, if I may say so. He said something like, the fact that you have a lack of institutions of democracy in Muslim countries shows that there is no culture of democracy. And how you move from that to the conclusion is indicative of the kind of thinking that he was representing there. It is true that for a long time Muslim countries, Arab countries, some of them, did not have the institutions of democracy as they developed in the Western Hemisphere. But that does not mean necessarily that there was no culture of democracy or there was no culture of, say, consultation, no culture of social networking. These things, in fact, were there, but they were never visible. They were never part of the kind of the social political fabric of the society because they were considered to be illegitimate under authoritarian regime. So most of the culture of democracy had to go in a kind of clandestine way, instead of becoming a defining element of the society. And I think we realize now, after what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, it's clear that the base has been there all along. They were just waiting for that moment to kind of, spring forward and show to the world that, in fact, they do have the culture, the philosophy, the understanding, the perception of what a democratic society, a representative society should be like. And the institutions will be established along the way. But again, it's never a one-time project. Democracy is a work in progress. Even in the most advanced countries of the West, you always have to work on the system.
But let me just follow up with you for a minute. But in then designing a democracy and building it, is there something special about what is built in Muslim countries as opposed to, say, a Western model? And of course there's no one Western model, as we know, but is there something distinctive about the Muslim world?
Again, yes and no. I'm not dodging the question, but
no.
I'm just trying to, point to the multiple dimensions of this debate. In a sense, yes, there is something indigenous about Muslim culture, about Islamic tradition. And one has to take that into account to understand the dynamics of democracy and democratization in Muslim countries. For one, for instance, the way Western modernity developed in the 18th and 19th centuries has always had difficulties with the historical, religious, ethical, cultural norms and values of Muslim societies. There is a very anti-religion type of secularism, for example, a very radical form of the French type, Enlightenment type secularism, has always considered religion to be a threat to democracy, to development, to social cohesion, stability in the 19th century. And the founders of Islamic modernism in the 19th century and early 20th century believed in some of these ideas, but we've come a long way. We live in an age of multiple modernities where no single actor can define what modernity is now. But more importantly, we've moved from the stage of classical modernization to globalization. Because classical modernization had a well-defined model, and everything was kind of defined in Western Europe. The ideas were there, the ideas of the French Revolution, idea of individualism, secularism, nation-state, and other key founding ideas of the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment. But globalization has changed that completely. It's now moving in multiple directions, and everybody is contributing to that process. So there is not a single, trajectory here. There is a convergence of different ideas. That's why, to me, for example, it was no surprise to see people in Tahrir Square using the so-called social media. And suddenly some people, in my view, in a rather orientalistic way, woke up to the fact that, oh, you see, Egyptians know how to use Facebook. What was surprising about that? Of course they know, and they've been way ahead of the curve, in fact, in some of these areas.
All right, let me get Dr. Abdullah, weigh in on this. Is something special about a democracy in the Muslim world? Should there be?
I would say that in the perception about the Muslim world in the West, there is something specific. And it has moved and shifted today with the events of North Africa and Middle East, and also earlier in the Islamic world, like countries like Malaysia and India, like Malaysia and Indonesia. Democracy doesn't work in Muslim worlds. So that perception has shifted. And coming to my country today, they say that in Afghanistan it doesn't work. So it's not in the Arab world, it's not in the Islamic world.
Now it's switched to the Afghanistan.
Afghanistan doesn't work. That's the perception which is changing today. And there isn't anything inherent in the Islamic world that will prevent its population to achieve their inspirations. And referring to Egypt and Tahrir and Tahrir Square, but I was watching TV, CNN and BBC and the others, when people started praying during prayers time, there was an analysis attached to that perhaps this is Islamic Brotherhood. So they are not, they don't want democracy and so on and so forth. So that's the perception. And also what has strengthened this perception is the attempt by the despotic leaders, autocratic leaders, to communicate it all the time with their friends in the West, with their supporters in the West, that look, let the issues of the Islamic and Arab world for us to deal with it, because you don't know about the complications. It's our job, and we know how best to deal with it, and then of course avoiding any move towards democratization. So the combination of the two has created that perception, but nevertheless, when we are talking about liberal democracy in Islamic world, the role of Islam in its teachings, which in its tenets, in its spirit, if you're talking about justice, if you're talking about good governance, honesty, caring towards poor, equality, rights, and in peaceful coexistence, in accountability of the government. So you don't see any problem there. But then there are cultural aspects of it, which if there are attempts to copy those cultural aspects of the liberal world in the Muslim world,
and you don't think they fit?
Automatically there will be a reaction.
Ambassador Fahmy, how do you see this as you embark on this project?
Well, I actually don't see. I disagree with the question, frankly. I don't really see why people assume that democracy in the Muslim world is different, nor why it would be the same throughout the Muslim world. Because democracy per se, if you look at the basic principles and values you want to achieve, they would be shared in the Muslim world or outside the Muslim world. How we achieve them, even in the Muslim world, will be a function of each one of our histories, our own reality, our culture. So yes, I would argue that religion is an important component. It's the values which we have all embraced. But again, to defend Christianity and Judaism, if you look at the true interpretation of Christianity and Judaism, they also have embraced democracy. It's the misinterpretation of all three religions that ends up giving the wrong impression. And you can quote from all three of the sacred books provisions which would be anti-democratic if taken out of context, and which are purely democratic if taken in their larger context. So I just find this idea that is it possible in the Muslim world or not, a fixation from those outside of the world, rather than anything based on empirical evidence that is different in the Muslim world, or even there's a unified perception of democracy in the Muslim world.
So let me hear from Mr. Al-Jaberi on this. And my question, just for the record, is not can there be democracy in the Muslim world, but really, is there something particular about a Western model versus a model in the Muslim world? And I think you're saying, Ambassador Fahmy, you don't think so. You think every country is particular, and whether they're Muslim or mostly Christian is part of the detail, really. But let me ask Mr. Al-Jaberi, how do you see this? Because you all are right at the beginning in a way too.
Yeah, from our experience in Iraq in the last 7 years, you know, in Iraq it was a decade from dictatorship, and then immediately we switched toward the democratic process. So people, they were not really ready for this process. So I think first of all, we have to prepare the people for the democracy, for the culture. The democracy need to have a strong civil society. We need to build an institution. We need to build a trust between the people and the government. In our experience, I think we have election. Then when the government have the power, they marginalize the other. So this is not a real democratic process.
So you mean it's zero-sum game thinking, that whoever's in sees it as the chance to control, and people who are out see it that way too?
Yeah, you know, when some political group get in the power, so he will not accept the other. He come to the power by democracy, but he don't accept the power sharing. He don't accept the others to participate with him. And this is the principle of democracy. You have to accept the other. You have to accept the power sharing. The country will not build by one group or one person. So the culture of democracy, I think, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, we are not ready for this culture now.
Dr. Collin, not ready in the Muslim world?
Not ready for democracy?
I'm sure you disagree with that.
Well, perhaps it's a good idea to explain why we disagree. I think with the events in the Arab world happening now, and the new Arab Spring that is now flowering everywhere, two misperceptions that have shaped the understanding of a lot of people in the Western part of the world about the Arab world have come to the fore. One is Orientalism, the other one is Eurocentrism. And we need to overcome both. And let me explain what I mean by these. Orientalism is exactly what you just said. The Arab world is not ready for democracy. They tend to...
This is what I just want to point out Mr. Jabber said. I'm just rephrasing the question.
No, of course I'm not referring to you. But that's the mindset behind this thinking, which is still out there. Because, you see, my concern is that the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt happen so quickly. Now people want to see results as quickly now. That is, say, in Egypt in September, I think you will have the general elections and the presidential elections, and Tunisia hasn't announced the timetable yet, but they will probably have the elections in the fall as well. And then people would like to see an immediate outcome, an immediate transition to a fully functioning democracy. I think they should consider this even first elections as a transitional period. The first elections will not bring instant democracy to these countries, because after 3-4 decades of authoritarian rule, it's not easy to transform these political structures to democracy overnight. You will need new political formations, new political parties, new balances of power, a lot of hustle between different political groups. That that's an experience that people need to have there. But what I mean by Orientalism is that for some reason the Arab world, the Muslim world is not ready for democracy because historically they never had democracy. Secondly, their religion, their culture, their tribal ties, their mentality, their worldview, etc., doesn't really allow them to have a fully functioning democracy. I think we've seen very clearly what prevented the development of democratic institutions in most of the Muslim countries, Arab countries, over the last half a century or so. It was not the demands of the people, it was not their culture. Right. To the contrary, over the last 3-4 decades, the forces of liberalization, democracy, opposition have come from all kinds of different corners of those societies, including the so-called Islamists in the Arab world, in other places. The second problem is Eurocentrism. That is the idea that somehow the world order that was established in the 19th century will continue into the 21st century. Our perceptions of history, culture, politics, international relations, even art, education, media, somehow will remain untouched, and everything will be defined from a Eurocentric point of view. That is, the march of history began in earnest in ancient Greece, and from there the ideas of humanity, science, logic, etc. spread to the rest of the world. Yes, you had a long history of Islamic civilization, but it was only a long footnote, to what the Greeks had produced, and it was picked up again. So this Eurocentric narrative is still permeating, our conceptions about, as I said, culture, history, etc. That needs to change from our textbooks to the way we design our policies, our projects, our partnership. And now we have to acknowledge the fact that there are other equal partners around the world, and they will have to be respected on equal footing.
I want to try to focus this, take the West out of it if we can for a little bit. Let me just ask Ambassador Fahmy. Everyone talks about the Turkey model. Is there a Turkey model? And what do you think Egypt in this, what do you think that is, and what do you think Egypt would want to emulate or draw some lessons from, and what not perhaps to have?
Well, it depends on which phase of the Turkey model we're talking about. The Turkey model evolved over the years, and it reached a sense of maturity now that people are comfortable with. But it also went through some difficult steps as they evolved into a full democracy where they accepted the different points of view, including, for example, where exactly or how do you exercise the role of religion, politics, and vice versa. There's also always reference, when you talk about Turkey model, of the role of the military in safeguarding the state or the tenets of the state. That served Turkey well. If I look at where I'd like to see Egypt moving, frankly, we will have to define a role of religion in politics.
A role of what?
For religion in politics that we are comfortable with. And it will be somewhere left or to the right of the Turkish model. Where, what I would like to see, frankly, I would like to see in Egypt that ultimately when we set this up and exercise it properly, and I agree with Dr. Brahim that simply establishing the institutions is not enough. You have to exercise them once and twice to prove that this is working. I don't want to have a role for the military. I don't want to institutionalize that role. I want them to go back to the barracks, play their role as a professional army, and only be resorted to in real circumstances where, like we had recently, they were in the barracks. They were asked by the population to come out. They didn't come out and say, we are going to play this role to be the link between the past and the future. So I would not want to see that as part of the future of Egypt. But I respect the Turkish model as it evolved, as an experience that we should learn from and consequently gain from certain parts of it and try not to repeat other parts of it.
Dr. Abdullah, do you think there's a Turkey model? What does it mean in Iraq's case?
I would say that in terms of a model, there are a lot to learn from every democracy in the Muslim world, including from Turkey, which has been successful, functioning, a democracy, going through evolution, as Ambassador rightly mentioned, and there are a lot of lessons for the
like
Muslim
what?
world. First of all, there are lessons for the West as well.
But what are the lessons for
I will get into the lessons. Let's say Afghanistan. Yes. You mentioned Iraq.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm just having a bad night. Go ahead. I know. I've interviewed you in Afghanistan. Go ahead.
In Afghanistan, we started on the right foot to begin with in 2001. In the agreement which was signed between different groups, it was anticipated that we have a constitution at certain timetable. We have presidential elections, we have parliamentary elections. But at the same time, where we are today, it means that we are damaging that foundation, that shaky foundation that we had laid at the beginning, because the leadership doesn't believe in democracy. So there is one lesson for all of us, Muslim world and non-Muslim world, that in the first phases of nation building and state building, when the leader or leaders of that country does not believe or do not believe in the principles and values of democracy, artificially to make it around it, it will be difficult. While everywhere else today, even the leaders which they didn't believe in reform, in progress, and they were not looking forward but rather digging into their own ideas, they have started talking about reform. In Afghanistan, unfortunately, there is a sort of reverse gear. So that's the unfortunate situation in our country. While looking into the model, Turkish model, the ruling party before coming to power, what they were doing, they started with humanitarian assistances, apart from their political ideas, with humanitarian assistances, delivery of services to the people, community work, in a lot more grassroots work. And they found their place among the society and among the grassroots. And then, of course, their leadership also evolved in the course of time. And then they found their place among the society. What could be learned from the situation in Egypt and elsewhere, that's also very, very telling. In the same way that democratic forces evolved, like the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, they didn't jump into the wagon as there was an opportunity for them up there. So they saw the change. They were witness to the change, and they adopted themselves to what there was. So it's taken into account the conditions and circumstances of the country and the nation and diversity of societies, which one can learn from different models.
Mr. Jabber, how do you feel about this, about the Turkish model?
I think the Turkish model is the oldest model of democracy in the region. And the Turkish, they work to improve their system a lot. We know that in Turkey, now the Islamic, they run the country. So, but they are a combination of modern Islam. It's not like what we have in Iran or other countries. It's religious system. In Turkey, they concentrate on institution. They concentrate on how to improve the economy. They concentrate on how to build their country. The military are independent. They don't interfere in the politics, only to protect the constitution and to keep the country unified and to defend the nation. In the other countries, we find the military, they defend the political party of the president or of the the minister. So the Turkish model, I think, if we can do it in for example, in Iraq, it will be a very good model for us.
Let me get you, just to get to the issue of the role of Islam in building democracy. It's something Secretary Clinton said last night about how important inclusion is, and that, I'm paraphrasing her here, but that really you can't have a functioning democracy without including, and she was talking about women and different minorities, but she seemed to be also talking about different even groups within the Muslim majority. One, is she right, Dr. Khalin? Is she right about that? And if so, can that be at war with at least with some strains of thinking within the more conservative religious community about to what degree the state should be involved in enforcing a kind of either religious codes within the law or more, a kind of conformity?
The question of pluralism and including different points of view in the political process have been part and parcel of the Muslim tradition. If you look at the Muslim tradition as it has evolved from the 9th, 8th, 9th centuries to the modern period, but has obviously displayed different qualities in different times. But some of these basic qualities, basic principles of democracy, inclusive democracy, plural democracy, that we're talking about have been enshrined also in the Islamic tradition. These values that our other panelists mentioned, rule of law, transparency, accountability, justice, these are not alien to the Islamic tradition. I mean, when you talk about these things in Arabic, in Turkish, in Persian, or in Urdu, I mean, they immediately resonate with a much deeper and longer historical and religious connotation. For example, putting checks and balances in the system. Who controls the ruler? And being fair and just, in your action when you have power, how you exercise that power. Who are you responsible to in the exercise of that power, all the way from God, to your fellow citizens, etc. They've been part and parcel of the Islamic tradition at the religious theological level. And the spirit of cosmopolitan Islam, if I may use such a term, has been lost in the modern period, starting from the 19th century, because the wave of modernity or modernism.
What do you mean by cosmopolitan Islam? What do you mean by cosmopolitan Islam?
Cosmopolitan Islam is that inclusive vision of Islam that does not see difference as a threat, that considers diversity as a blessing from God, as it is said in the sayings of the Prophet and as has been repeated by many scholars, that has been developed. Even if you look at some of the key texts of the Islamic political history, for example, look at Al-Farabi. His model of a virtuous society, Al-Madinat al-Fadila, talks about this, how these different communities, religious, political, social communities, in fact, shall come together to establish this virtuous society. The goal, the main point is not about the state, it's about the society. It's not about, grabbing power from the state. It's really educating, training, empowering a society that will have the values of virtue, respect, inclusion, and diversity. And that spirit, unfortunately, has been lost under the heavy pressure of 19th century experience that the Islamic world had vis-a-vis the Western world, because modernity in most of the time in the 19th century came to the Muslim world coupled with European colonialism, and people reacted to it immediately. And the legacy of colonialism, or the memory of colonialism, has remained very strong in the background of the Muslim communities. People in the West tend to forget that. For them, European colonialism ended in maybe 1914 or 1918, but it continued. In fact, for some, it still continues in the case of the Palestine issue.
Ambassador Fahmy, you wanted to jump in, and any one of you wants to jump in a moment, just go like that, because please.
Yes, I mean, the point I wanted to make was, for any religion, if we interpret the religion in an exclusive fashion, at the expense of others, then that interpretation will not be a democratic interpretation. that's consistent with what we all want to achieve as democratic nations. But it's not because one says that we are a Muslim nation or a Christian nation or a Jewish nation that we're necessarily undemocratic. I want to refer you that...
Yes, every religion has that strain in it.
Yes, and if I actually take you back to the Egyptian experience, first of all, we actually had a democratic system before the revolution in '52, but it was not representative of all the people, but it was, into the institutions, democratic. But all the way back to the 1920s, we had a constitution which actually had reference that Islam was the religion of the state, which was much stronger than the constitution in 1971. But that constitution in the 20s was much stronger in terms of the liberal values and the democratic values than the one 50 years later. So while the language about religion was stronger, it was not exclusive. At the same time, the Constitution was providing equal rights for everybody in the country, whether they were Muslim or not. So one has to be careful here. It's not the Muslim world or democracy. It's, do we have democratic values? Are we applying them or not? I strongly believe that it's not about religion, it's how we interpret the religions.
But what about this question about inclusion and diversity versus a kind of exclusivity? I mean, what are the challenges, and let me ask either you, Dr. Abdullah, or Mr. Jabber, to cosmopolitan Islam, which was defined by Mr. Khalil as an inclusive vision of Islam that does not see diversity as a threat. What are the challenges to that, and how do you overcome them?
When it gets involved or stuck in daily politics or power politics of the country, and when the leaders of a country play politics rather than show leadership, then of course they see it in their interest to use these differences in order to strengthen their power base. That's their perception, but that's exactly the way to weaken the real power base, which is, if you're considering the people as the source of power. So it's in there that we lose sight of the richness which is in the diversity, and that's the temptation for the politician, for the political leaders sometimes, to use it in their favor as they see it, as they calculate it, while they are using it, but meanwhile what they are losing is the trust of the people and the trust of the nation over such politics and such games.
Mr. Collin, you want to back in?
This discussion is getting too serious, so I want to...
Okay, a little levity.
I want to tell a joke that will maybe, will shed some light on some of these dynamics in the Islamic tradition. Because sometimes people have this perception that since Islam is a monotheistic religion, its politics is also monotheistic, meaning that it turns easily into monolithic politics. Everything revolves around the idea of monotheism, the unity of God, Tawheed. Therefore, Islamic politics is bound to be monolithic. We've seen this kind of reading of the Islamic tradition. It's funny. I mean, it couldn't be, of course, far from the truth. I mean, if you look at Islamic experience, the experience of Muslim societies with diversity, with pluralism, it's been remarkable in Turkey, in Egypt, in Iraq, in many, many other places. When Iraq was the cradle of civilization, for example, in the 10th, 11th centuries, some of the greatest scholars, translators, scientists were Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and they really created this cosmopolitan culture there together in Andalusia, in Afghanistan, in many other parts of the Muslim world. But what is funny is that, according to the story, Muslims of India, one day meet Christian missionaries. And after some conversations with them, they say, well, we support your work in India. And suddenly say, well, how can Muslims support Christian missionaries, in India? No, you're doing a wonderful job. We encourage you to continue your work in India. Then one day they ask, why? Well, you're trying to, you're working in an Indian society where there are millions of gods, and you're trying to bring them from 1 million to 3, From 3 to 1, it's easier. You know, we'll take care of the rest. Of course, in the daily lives of people, it works in a different way. But the point is that the Muslim world needs to recover that spirit of cosmopolitan Islam, and I think we're seeing some good signs of that across the Muslim world.
Mr. Jabber, do you agree that that's really an essential ingredient in building a functioning democracy?
I think the diversity, if they used it in a proper way, it's a very good, it's a huge enrichment for the society. But in our countries, sometimes they use this diversity and minority to abuse the system. So we see in some countries, they approach some minorities to the power. They give them a power, and then they marginalize the majority to protect the president or the governor.
Can you give us an example of what you're speaking of?
There is one example. I don't want to mention example, but what we have in Iraq.
This is off the record, isn't it?
Democracy.
But what we have in Iraq, for example, we have, I think, 14 minorities and religion. All the people are integrated and involved in the politics. But there is some marginalization, some in the name of democracy, in the name of a new system, so they don't give them the real role to participate in the power, to have their role to build the country. So this is the abuse of the democracy for the minorities.
What about the inclusion of women? That was another one of her major points last night, that really in this global economic times in which we live, you cannot have a successful, robust democracy without economic growth, and you really can't have that by 50% of your population being not fully educated and, if they wish to, fully engaged professionally. Do you think she's right, or is that a kind of a Western value?
I think she is right, but how to achieve it, that will depend on the conditions and circumstances of each country, and you cannot expect every country to act in the same pace. But to deny this as a principle, to reject this as a principle, it will be wrong from its foundation. And unfortunately, there I think in the third world and in the Muslim world, we are all lagging behind. Whatever the type of regimes are, the women's participation in political life, in the society, education, and every field of life, we are lagging behind. We are far behind where we ought to be. And this should be considered as one of the reasons for the backwardness, and not to utilizing the potentials which are there. And there is no doubt that there are many types of approaches towards this. One is the artificial, just only in order to some regimes resort to this in order to please Western friends. They do a few token things as a symbol of women's right, while masses of women population, especially in rural areas, they live as they live and nothing changes in their lives. So a sort of genuine effort, indigenous effort in empowering women and giving them the opportunities and providing the opportunities and bringing women together and making them part of that engine of change in the society. That's the fundamental ingredient for development in any country, Muslim and non-Muslim.
But it can be a struggle in some more conservative societies, can't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. It will be faced with resistance from the religious conservative corners. The traditionalists will use it as a tool against any type of progress. And just to, without going too long in this respect, I read one of the letters from a king of Afghanistan from, in the 1920s, and his problem of opening a school in Kandahar is more or less the same as today's government in Afghanistan of keeping a school for girls open in Kandahar. So you see how difficult bringing these changes are and how slow the pace of change has been in some parts of the world.
Mr. Jabber, what about in Iraq? I mean, when I was there, I was struck by as a first-timer by how different parts of the country feel. I think that most Americans would be surprised. I mean, if you're up in, you know, Baghdad or Ramadi, it's one thing, and if you're in Najaf, it's quite a different feel, including the role of women, the participation of women. I mean, one, do you think that's really an important battle to be fought now? I mean, Secretary Clinton seems to be saying it is. Or not. Let's just leave it at that. Do you? And if so, how do you do it when you've got different regions of the country that clearly see it very differently?
No, the women in Iraq, they are suffered too much. In new Iraq now, we have quota for the women, for example, in the parliament. They have 25% from the parliament for the women. But unfortunately, they don't have their role in the government. The political leader, they don't give them any real role to play in the new Iraq.
They're tokens, as Dr. Abdullah was speaking of.
Yeah. So this is the marginalization for almost 55% from the people in Iraq. Why? Because the political process in Iraq are not mature yet. They don't recognize the capacity of the woman. They don't recognize the partnership for the other. So I think for this reason, when I say we are not ready for democracy, because in the end, they go back to what they want to do, not on the democratic pace. We find, for example, in Iraq, there is one political bloc, they win the election, but they stop them to form the government. So where is the democracy? If we believe in democratic process, we have to respect the result of the election. So we find one group win the election, but the other group, because they have the power, they have the tools, they stop them to form the government. And there is no one from the international community say this is not acceptable. You have to respect the democracy. This is the situation.
Hard to believe, but we're getting kind of close in one way. I want to go to the topic of what the West can do to help, but meanwhile people ask questions. Well, I'll tell you what, let's go to questions for a few minutes. Go ahead. Right here, and the microphone will follow you. And if you could state your name and who you're with, and then I've been urged to say, I'm sure you have something you want to say, but please phrase it as a question.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
It's İlhan Taner from Hürriyet Daily News and Vatan, Turkish press. I would like to ask first Dr. Cullen, and if anyone would like to jump in. Even though panelists touch on role of religion in the Muslim countries, I want to press on secularism. And first, Mr. Cullen, how much do you think, how vital secularism for you, for your administration going forward? And second, if you may, you are a religious scholar, so historically and culture, in these perspectives, how do you think the secularism is compatible with Islam in general term? I know this is a very large question, but you may be able to break up a little bit, because we know that at the beginning of the Islam there is no secularism, and that makes a big difference when you compare with the West. And the last one is Turkish role. We talk about Turkish role. Again, in the same context, in secularism, how do you think secularism would be the part of, or how vital part of this Turkish role, if not now, going forward, how realistic it is to, take this, secularism part of it to, again, the Muslim countries. Thanks so much.
You know what I think I'm going to do is, what we did before, is have a couple, 2 or 3 questions, and then have the panelists answer. So the gentleman right behind, okay, and then, yes, thank you, the gentleman behind you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Mr. Yusuf Abdul Rahman.
And you're from?
I'm a native Washingtonian from the local.
Are you just here on your own?
Yes.
Oh, I'm
local
sorry. I meant
Muslim community in the Washington, D.C. area. Basically speaking in the context of the cosmopolitan Islam or minority groups, speaking of a minority group, as a voice representing about 50% of the Muslim population in America, which is the black American Muslims, and also a native of Washington, D.C., here in the Washington, D.C. area, how do we, the U.S., speaking of the US-Islamic relations, how do we, as the U.S., reconcile sending a message of freedom, justice throughout not just Libya, but the Muslim world in general, and not have voting rights here in the Washington, D.C. area among the citizens of Washington, D.C.? Thank you.
Good. Thank you. And applause for that one. And do we have a third question that wants to go in this round, in this young man right here?
Good question.
And then you all can kind of pick and choose.
But that applies only to
responding.
Washington.
Hi, my name is Udit Thakur. I'm a student at American University, a volunteer here.
Great.
My question goes to anyone on the panel, and it comes to the issue of cosmopolitan Islam. Would the distinguished gentleman on the board be willing to humor the idea that the problem is not so much in modernizing Islam so much as modernizing the way that we look at Islam? For instance, I remember a gentleman over here, Navo Fahmy, brought forward the idea that in the West, the way that we developed in democracy was secularism, that it was separate from the state. But I would make the argument that it actually wasn't. It was simply a revolution in the way that we looked at God. If you look at all the writings of Jefferson and everyone, there's these constant allusions to natural law. They simply changed the idea. So I would say, would the people on the board agree that the idea and the problem is that the way that we look at Islam is something centered in the culture of the Middle East? Whereas, I mean, just for instance, on this board, we have no one from the 4 largest Muslim populations in the world: India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia. This is a board centered in the culture of the Middle East. And like Imam Faisal Rauf from the Ground Zero Islamic Center said at American University just a few months ago, the problem now today is that Muslims worship Islam over worshiping God.
Well, there's a lot in those questions. And who'd like to go first?
In response to the first question about secularism, there are 2 meanings or definitions of secularism. One is what you might call institutional secularism or procedural secularism, and the other one is the kind of substantial secularism as a worldview, as a way of life. In the first case, separating the institutions of religion from the institution of politics and protecting the rights, the religious rights of all groups, or non-religious rights of all groups, and keeping the state in equal distance from all belief. That definition of secularism has been widely accepted in various Muslim countries and also in the Anglo-American form of secularism. Whereas secularism as a worldview, as an ideology, as an identity, that's also something people can choose freely, obviously, for themselves. The trouble is, or the problem is, when state begins to impose that ideology upon its citizens in the name of modernity, in the name of development, in the name of national unity, in the name of national security, as it happened in our country, in Turkey. For many years, secularism was used as a smokescreen for a number of other things. When things didn't go well, when those in power didn't run the state well, they just simply failed in delivering services to the people, etc., they immediately, raised the flag of, oh, secularism, that's the most important value we have, etc. That's fine. I mean, let's have a discussion about secularism. But when you're failing to run a country, when you're failing to respond to the demands of the people, when you keep, plotting this military coup one after another in the name of, again, protecting secular democracy in Turkey, then I think now, as it is happening over the last decade or so, people begin to question the credentials of your claims about protecting secularism. In the case of Turkey, from now on, how that will work out in Turkish democracy, I think it's for Turkish society, it's a process of maturity or maturing as a whole, with these values of diversity, cosmopolitan Islam. For example, some of the things that we consider to be taboos for many years in Turkey, Kurdish issue, the Alevis, non-Muslim minorities, and women's rights and human rights, etc. Now we have a very free, vibrant, open debate about these issues. And if you look at who is really opposing this debate, who is opposed, for example, to giving more religious right to religious minorities in Turkey, or to recognizing the rights of Kurds to practice their culture, or similar issues, it's not the conservative religious communities of Turkey. It's a new breed of nationalism that has emerged in Turkey, which very much allies itself with the establishment in Turkey. And they're opposed not only to this, but also to Turkey's EU membership and a number of other initiatives which make Turkey, in fact, an attractive model or example. And in regards to Washington voting rights, I fully support you, my brother there.
Professor Fahmy, you were singled out.
Yes, let me quickly address a couple of the points. First of all, I wouldn't waste much time on the discussion of secularism and democracy in the Middle East, or, if you want, the Muslim world. I say this because it's not, again, about Islam. Let's take Israel. Everybody's saying it is the first or the only democracy in the Middle East, the traditional Middle East. Well, it's not secular. And if you try to anytime soon, because of the very important role of religion in our societies. That's not the problem. The problem is our problem. We need to be, as Muslims, need to continue to revisit our religion and continue to interpret our religion faithfully in a macro perspective looking towards the future. That's our challenge. There was a question about whether the problem was how you looked at us and whether or not. Well, first of all, there is a problem about how you look at us. Two quick examples. You keep talking about Arab Springs. Talk about Arab summers. Springs are short. And if you want this to succeed, you need a much longer period of time. So that's just one example. The other example is the idea that women throughout the Arab world or the Muslim world can't play a prominent role. You mentioned Bangladesh and Indonesia. They both had women heads of state. You haven't had one in America, but you've had one in large Muslim countries. It hasn't happened in my country, at least not in contemporary history. So these problems exist in different parts of the Muslim world, but it's not really only a function of the faith. Muslim countries will interpret the faith more liberally in certain areas than in others because of the history around their own culture in that particular area. So, yes, I think Muslim women should be given more rights. Muslim women, well, women in Egypt got their voting rights before Switzerland. But without a doubt, they've had a lot of rights curtailed in the second half of the last century, and we're trying to give them back to them presently. So it's not only the issue of religion, but we as Muslims have to rethink our own religion in a more progressive sense.
Is anyone else dying to jump in here, or do we have another question? We have two other questions. Because I'm already approaching the red zone here on my clock. And there are two people right at this table, I think. If you just keep your hands up, those someone. Thanks.
Should I go ahead? I was somewhat surprised by...
I'm sorry, just your name and your affiliation.
Oh, sorry. Stephen Cull, University of Maryland, Program on International Policy Attitudes. I was somewhat surprised by the sense that of a kind of resistance to the idea that there's something unique about Islam and democracy, or as an Islamic form of democracy. There are, in numerous constitutions, there is reference to Sharia as the basis of law. And while in a purely liberal democracy, the will of the people is entirely the source of law. There's no question that within the Islamic world there is very strong interest in the notion of the will of the people as a basis for law as well. And I think there's no question that there's some tension between these ideas of Sharia as the basis of law and the will of the people as the basis of law, which doesn't mean that they're incompatible, but there is a process that's going on. And to say that there's no difference when it's really spelled out really quite clearly in the Constitution that there is something unique here about the way democracy plays out in an Islamic context. So I'm just curious why you sort of deflect that as a proposition rather than in sort of embracing it as something that is actually going on as a process in these societies.
Great question. Yes, sir? Right there.
Salam Al-Mariati with the Muslim Public Affairs Council. I think also, you know, there's so many issues that have no consensus in the Muslim world. For example, there's no consensus on what an Islamic state is. I mean, if you go to Iran, it's one version. It's a form of a theocracy that even, as one of our panelists said, you know, if you look at more of the cosmopolitan aspects of Islam, whereas I would call it religious pluralism within Islam, the religious pluralists in Iran are against the theocrats in Iran. So there's an internal struggle over what the definition of an Islamic state is. And definitely if you go to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and so many other countries that claim to be an Islamic republic or an Islamic state, there's no consensus on what that means. So there's a lot to you know, and adding on to my colleague who asked the question, there's a lot more to be involved in the discourse, I think. And so how do we get to the point where we heed the will of the people? And when I say we, not only the rulers in the Middle East, but we here in the West, as the primary factor for what kind of governance the people want. And I think if we approach it that way, then that will meet the goals of the people. It will fulfill these religious obligations because, as was stated before, the Islamic legacy is one of egalitarianism, of shura, which means consultation, of bay'ah, which means, literally, it means voting, and so many other things. And then finally, you know, the whole premise of, you know, whether we can have democracy in the Muslim world is so artificial, because the alternative is does that mean that Islam accepts dictatorship, when in fact dictatorships have had the strongest opposition from Islamic groups? So how do we get to understanding the region more from the West? And it leads to the final point. Do you believe then that President Obama and his administration is navigating through this political minefield effectively in dealing with all these issues, while at the same time negotiating geopolitical interests with the will of the people of the Muslim world?
I should have imposed the rule that the White House tries to. Only one question, but those are great questions. I'd like everyone to hear from all of you panelists, and let me just, following up on that very last question about the United States, just throw in the thing that I promised Ken I wouldn't let get short shrift, and I'm sorry. But it is, you know, Secretary Clinton said that the U.S. and the West want to help partner and assist, but not impose. And so what is the one thing that you think the United States and the European countries and other countries who want to assist can do? So that's a lot to, now I've added a question to everyone else's question. So do you want to go first,
Yeah.
Dr. Abdallah?
Looking at the Islamic world, avoiding stereotyping and in all judgment, that will open the way for learning more and understanding more about what Islamic world is. And there is no doubt that not only among the Islamic world, but also within the Islamic country, majority Muslim countries, there are diversity of ideas, of
Is that
groups.
your answer to Stephen Caldwell, who was saying,
Yeah.
why is there an unwillingness to acknowledge, if I'm summing up your question, which was that there is a sort of tension?
No, exactly in regards to the question of Sharia, there are countries which have risen above these questions, and in their constitution they have addressed their democratic system, the principles of the democratic system as it has been required, and this is not an impediment in that, or there are not references as such. But when I mentioned at the beginning briefly that the role of Islam, it cannot be denied, whether it is in part of its jurisdiction or jurisprediction or in other areas.
Mr. Jabber, would you like to take any of these questions? No. All right.
Can I jump in on this? Again, I think we're mixing up two different issues. Is there a problem that has to be addressed in the Muslim world to get democratic systems working effectively? And is there a contradiction between Islam as a religion and democracy? I challenge that there is a contradiction between democracy and Islam. I've said openly, we need, as a Muslim community, to revisit our own thinking and see how our community can be faithful to the religion and consequently do that in a more modern fashion to be consistent with the tenets of democracy. If you look at different Muslim countries, you will see references to Sharia in a different fashion. Again, if you look at Egypt, for example, the reference there, it is the principles of Islam, not the actual language. And why is that? Because we have a 10% minority of Christians, which you can't apply that to them directly. To the question about America, well, first of all, the reason you're having so much difficulty with this issue of Islam, besides our issues, is you only started looking at it post 9/11. So your interest in Islam is starting from a very negative point, understandably. It's a function of what happened in 9/11, and you're trying to find all the answers to 9/11 in Islam. It's understandable, but you're not going to find the answers that way. What you can do, however, nobody will listen to you talking about our own faith in our part of the world. You want to make an investment that will serve us and serve you. It's an education of youth. That's really the essence of using whatever your faith is in a modern fashion and a more
There again, I mean, I agree with Ambassador. There are two levels of this discussion. One is the kind of theological, religious, intellectual debate we can have. The other one is the policy level. And that's a healthy debate that the Muslim world should have about, different models of, running a government, reconciling it with Islamic principles, Sharia, etc. Because again, Islamic history is so rich in its, different possibilities. If you look at different political orders that have developed over the centuries, the Medinan model is not exactly the same as a sultanate, or emirate, is different from the Persian political tradition. It's interesting, Fatih Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Istanbul, had 4 titles which he proudly carried throughout his life. He said he is a Hakan, which refers to the Turkish political history or Turkish political culture, meaning the ruler in Turkish. And then he says, I am a Sultan, referring to the Arabic political tradition, that I am also the leader of my Arab subjects. He called himself also a Padishah, which in Persian means, again, the ruler or ruler of rulers, referring to his Persian subjects. And most strikingly, he said, I am also the Kaiser, meaning I am the Caesar. And he said, I am the Kaiser Rum, I am the Caesar of Rome, referring to his Christian subjects, non-Muslim subjects. And he didn't see any contradiction in that vision. From that to 19th century Ottoman efforts to modernization. So I mean, you have interesting examples, a variety of different political orders. And I think the Muslim world in the 21st century will now have to experiment with differences. As I said at the beginning, democracy is a work in progress. Western democracies are working on their democracies, on various aspects of democracy. Therefore, we will have a similar debate in the Muslim world. But as far as policy is concerned, there are lots of practical issues we have to address. The question of women, for example. Yes, maybe some more narrow-minded, conservative understanding of religion has a role or is responsible for the lesser role that women play in Muslim countries. But there are also other much bigger structural problems. I'll give one example from Turkey. Women in rural areas in Turkey, all right, I'm wrapping up.
Yeah.
Are much more actively involved in social life of their own immediate environment. When they migrate to urban centers, to big cities, suddenly their social agency diminishes. And the reason is that because, at least in Turkey until very recently, our urban centers have developed so badly. No planning, no strategic thinking about how 10 million people, for example, will live in one city, what kind of provisions we will have to make for them. And suddenly the sense of insecurity dominates their choices. And those same women who used to work, be part of the social economic life in the rural setting, suddenly goes to home and never leaves the home. And because that's a safe place for them. Religion has nothing to do with this. I mean, it's our urban policies, it's our policies of development. And some of these issues, I think, are out there, again, as very practical issues for all of the countries that we're talking about.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank our panelists, Jabber, AlJaberi, Ibrahim, Cullen, Nabil Fahmy, and Abdullah. Thank you.
Just 3 quick program notes about tomorrow. First, the working groups begin at 9:45. At 11, we have a terrific plenary on the role of the media, moderated by David Gregory. That will be immediately followed by a lunch plenary, where we will bring together the whole of the proceedings of the forum, and you'll get to hear a bit about what the working groups have been doing. See you all tomorrow. Good day.
Up next on C-SPAN 2, a House panel looks at the